first of all. And secondly, my very first conference on Sudan, together with Niels, that makes it all more exciting for me. Now, what I have noticed listening to the speeches was that there is a big interest in talking, discussing, and elaborating regional and international mediation efforts. So, and this exactly is the theme of this afternoon panel. Now, let me just try to set this scene for you in saying, well, the history of international crisis management has taught us that once a crisis erupts, there is usually no lack of mediation. In the contrary, there is usually a run for peace initiatives by many, many actors. And the history of crisis management teaches us also that conflicts can be prolonged by peace initiatives. When these are not coordinated, when these are not led, when too many actors are involved and no one takes the lead. Well, I think it was already mentioned that Libya is a very good example for failed peace initiatives, right? Well, recently we have seen a flurry of diplomatic activity and efforts also with regard to bringing this brutal conflict in Sudan to an end. And I myself, I kind of lost track by looking up who has initiated what. So, you know, and what roadmaps were already designed and communiques issued and so on and so forth. And then I found, well, there is this IGAD forum on Sudan, obviously, called the Quartet. There is this trilateral mechanism. There is the Quad. There is the UN framework. There is the American-Saudi initiative. Then the Egyptian with the Qataris want to have their own summit. And then there are these multilateral organizations, right? The African Union, the EU is also partly engaged. And of course, also the countries from the Gulf. So too many cook can spoil the broth, as we know. So we want to discuss all these initiatives, the need to harmonize these initiatives, and who should be in charge for the initiatives. So my questions to my panelists would be, and I would be really grateful if you could consider these questions in your presentations, is who is in lead, who should be in lead? Do these efforts complement each other, or is there a danger that they cancel each other out? What role do we envision, do you envision for the United Nations? And who wants what? Who has leverage over the two main parties, conflicting parties in Sudan? Well, this would be, as a moderator, my questions. And with this, I want to invite our first speaker, with whom I already negotiated that he would not extend 10 minutes, because I understand that you want to be brought, that you want to us to bring you in for the debate, and I'll try my best to assure that this happens. So now, our first speaker is Mr. Walter Ochanda, Senior Director of the Program and Partnership at the IGAD, and he comes with a lot of conflict resolution experience. Please.
Thank you very much, our moderator. Your Excellencies, ambassadors present, distinguished panelists and participants, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol duly and respectfully observed. Of course, we all know that in today's world, our lives are interconnected. And it is a point that was raised some years back in the 1770s. There was a famous Scottish economist by the names of David Hume. He said, there was a time we didn't know about lives of others, but ever since we knew about them, neither can we draw the boundaries between us and them wider. I think the point he was trying to raise is that our lives are somehow interconnected. And therefore, it is this sense that we all have, no matter where we are, a stake, responsibility, role in stopping the devastating conflict that is ravaging in Sudan and returning the country back to the path of peace, stability, and development. I therefore understand and appreciate the HON's and, of course, all other stakeholders' interest in the unfolding situation in Sudan. IGAD, as a regional organization with a mandate to facilitate and foster regional integration and development by, among others, promoting peace and stability, has been engaging in Sudan, as you know very well, since the first coup happened on the 25th October 2021. And this was through the trilateral arrangement. As you know, that a breakthrough was made on December 5th, 2022, and a political framework was signed between, of course, the military, which is the Sudanese Armed Forces, and the Rapid Support Forces and the civilian groups. Subsequently, signatories of the framework and the trilateral mechanism established a coordination mechanism and organized series of conferences. All the conferences, of course there were 5, but all the conferences except one on security and military reforms, so active participation of civil society, non-signatories, and made sets of recommendations that were expected to inform the political agreement. However, differences that arose from the security and military reform conferences, particularly relating to the timeline for the integration of RSF, hindered further progress in the political process. SAF, of course, advanced the idea that integration should take place within 2 years, while on the other hand, RSF argued that it should be completed within 10 years. Despite relentless efforts by the trilateral mechanism and the international community, as well as, of course, national stakeholders to resolve the differences, tension continued, and there was that conflict that took place on the 15th of April 2023. Distinguished participants, as you can see, or as has been presented also by previous speakers, the humanitarian and material toll is very high. Scores of people have been displaced, both internally and also others as refugees outside the country. But what makes the conflict more devastating is the fact that Khartoum is a theater of conflict, and it is densely populated, and also it is the country's economy and the political heartbeat of Sudan. So we also have to extend appreciation to our member states who have opened their borders, of course, to receive refugees who are fleeing this conflict. And though, of course, this humanitarian crisis is also putting a strain on their already fragile economies. Mindful of this responsibility and the adverse impact of the conflict has had on the region and beyond, IGAD was one of the first organizations that held the first, what we call, it was a virtual head of state and government summit. That was on the 16th, 24 hours after the conflict broke out. And the summit, of course, called for the warring parties to immediately and conditionally cease hostilities, de-escalate tensions, and also open humanitarian corridors. During that summit, we also had the establishment of a high-level delegation of 3 heads of state. Of course, at that time, included His Excellency Salva Kiir of South Sudan, Republic of South Sudan, His Excellency Dr. William Ruto, President of Kenya, and His Excellency Ismail Gule of Djibouti. But the high-level delegation was chaired, of course, by Salva Kiir at that time. In the next 2 months following that, the high-level delegation continued to engage with the parties. In fact, both SAF and RSF sent their special envoys to Juba. So the issue of access, which was being raised sometime in the morning, I would like to say that our leaders actually have access to the principals. The leaders who constitute the quartet, they have access to this. So they sent their representatives to Juba. However, the ceasefire that was secured at that time did not hold, just like the one that was secured by the Jeddah process by Saudi Arabia and the United States. In the meantime, IGAD continues to be part and contribute to ongoing joint efforts in the framework of the expanded mechanism and the core group, which is coordinated by the African Union. And IGAD is also a member of the secretariat of this same arrangement. I would also like to report that on the 12th of June, IGAD convened the 14th Ordinary Assembly of Heads of State and Government in Djibouti. And during this meeting, Sudan was top on the agenda. And it was during this meeting that Ethiopia was added to the high-level delegation, and then it was renamed to what we're now calling IGAD Quartet. And the President of Kenya, His Excellency Dr. William Ruto, was appointed as the chair of the quartet. During the same summit, the leaders also adopted a roadmap for the peace process in Sudan. And the priority task that was given to the quartet was to facilitate a face-to-face meeting with the principals in any of the capitals in our region. Of course, an agreement was also reached to secure a commitment from the two principals to establish humanitarian corridors and initiate an inclusive political process. A week later, which was on June 19th, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the quartet met, of course, with a view to operationalize and implement the roadmap that was agreed. And then also during that time, they discussed the modalities and timelines for the implementation of the roadmap and the need to prioritize the face-to-face meeting as a means of unlocking agreement on ceasefire and opening of humanitarian corridors was also underscored. The leaders also agreed to and resolved to launch an inclusive political process and also agreed to appoint IGAD Special Envoy for Sudan to coordinate and lead IGAD mediation efforts in the Republic of Sudan. Distinguished participants, on the 10th of July, the heads of state and government of the quartet countries again met in Addis Ababa with a view to discuss in depth the implementation of the roadmap in terms of the peace process in Sudan, as well as, of course, discuss ways on facilitating humanitarian assistance, protection of civilians, but also to engage in an all-inclusive Sudanese-owned and Sudanese-led dialogue towards a sustainable peace in Sudan. After that meeting, there was another meeting that took place on the 6th of September 2023 here in Kenya on the margins of the 2023 Africa Climate Summit to take stock, of course, of the implementation of the roadmap for peace in Sudan. And the meeting also mandated IGAD in collaboration with the African Union to accelerate consultations, to map the agenda, the venue, and identify participants and other relevant matters in support of the political dialogue, of course with a view to defining clearly a Sudanese-owned and Sudanese-led political process. So this process is still ongoing. As you can see, IGAD is very much committed to peacefully resolve the conflict in Sudan without further delay and has made commendable steps towards realization of this goal. IGAD also recognizes that sustainable peace in Sudan can only be achieved through a transparent and honest collaboration with national, regional, and international actors and stakeholders. So that is very important for IGAD. As I conclude, as we embark on this bumpy process or journey, we are and we will be faced with, of course, plethora of challenges, including the multiplicity of decision-making centers within the warring parties. That's one of the challenges that we foresee. The issue of proliferation of initiatives, efforts, and the fragmentation of the stakeholders. The issue of violation of the ceasefire. These are some of the challenges we see. Of course, the deteriorating humanitarian access, but also the issue of lack of funding are some of the challenges that we foresee in the process. But nonetheless, as the saying goes, where there is a will, there is always a way, yeah? So there is a role for all meaning actors based on our comparative advantages and leverages, and the crisis in Sudan is a collective responsibility that requires collective and harmonized solution. I believe if we are fragmented, then the suffering will continue, and that the process will become more complicated, and maybe the crisis might even become worse. So I believe this conference provides all stakeholders with an opportunity to deliberate and, of course, gather information that can inform and shape policies and also the effective interventions in the Republic of South Sudan. I thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Very precise, very to the point. You gave us a very good overview of the activity. The last 4 points that you made with the challenges, I think these are the issues that we have to go in depth during the discussion. So now I would like to invite Mrs. Rahel Hassan. She has just a month ago joined the Institute for Security Studies, if I'm correctly informed. Sorry? Oh, 6 months ago. So I think there was a just mistake. Sorry for this. But she has a wide range of experience in working with intergovernmental organizations as well. So please.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'll be reflecting on mediation as well, but mainly focusing on the Quad and the Troika, and trying to narrow down a little bit on evaluating the progress, the challenges, the shortcomings in navigating Sudan's complex political landscape. So the purpose of this presentation will be to provide or try and provide an in-depth examination of the mediation efforts. And throughout the presentation, I'll also try to evaluate the progress made. But the main purpose should be to trigger conversations and insight from the room, and particularly those in the room who have had the opportunity to look at the mediation processes closely, and not necessarily from a distant research perspective. So the Quad consists of Norway, Saudi Arabia, UAE, the UK, and the Troika, the UK, US, and Norway. So these groups have taken on a pivotal role in attempting to bridge the gaps, broker peace, and facilitate Sudan's path towards a more stable and peaceful future. So looking at the formation of these groups, each member of the Quad brings a unique strength to the table, as does the member of the Troika. So if we look at the Quad, we have Norway. Norway is well known and experienced for negotiations. They have diplomatic expertise, well known for peace building efforts, and they play a crucial role in facilitating the negotiations and the dialogue. Saudi Arabia and the UAE bring the regional influence and the financial support to some extent to the mediation process as well. It was brought up earlier today how Sudan's proximity to the Arabic world is important to highlight. The UK leverages its historical ties with Sudan and to an extent with Egypt, and contributes to the diplomatic efforts in conflict resolution. And then, of course, we have the US that leverages its diplomatic influence and resources to advance peace and security, or try and advance peace and security in this particular process. So looking at the progress that has been made by the process so far, I think the main outcome that we can highlight is the Juba Peace Agreement of 2022. So the agreement is quite comprehensive in content. It's inclusive of the points of impasse between the parties, particularly referring to SSR, which was one of the main triggers, if not the main trigger for the conflict. And then it also prepares the ground for transition. It provides room to have the inclusion of women and youth. It provides a 40% quota for women in particular, for example. And then it also takes notes of resistant committees, people with disabilities, different interest groups. And I'll come to why the diversity in stakeholders is quite important. And then finally, it also touches upon quite a sensitive issue. Who or what actors have the monopoly for violence and form part of the state military and intelligence structure, and it particularly addresses the RSF as part of the security and military reform plan that will lead into a one national professional army. And again, this addresses one of the points of conflict or the most sensitive parts of the conflict. So I could say in looking at the progress that's been made, the Juba Peace Agreement is one of the more important milestones. But of course, that brings me to the challenges. And the first one is that implementation of the framework and even trying to diversify the different stakeholders in the framework has been a very painstaking and slow process, and not necessarily something that the Quad and Troika can address independently or through mediation alone. And then there's the diversity and division of stakeholders. It's very difficult to identify a comprehensive set of representatives for each part of the stakeholders in the mediation. Then, of course, we have the parallel mediation processes that are taking place. Forum shopping was mentioned this morning as one of the dangers of having so many mediators in the equation. And Sudan has really shown us that more peace builders does not mean more peace. And then there's also the lack of consensus at the UNSC level. Mediation is only one approach of trying to resolve a conflict. It should almost always be coupled with I don't want to say coercive, but with a compelling element that comes from a higher level of political decision making. And the lack of consensus at the UNSC level renders the UN unable to compel the parties to comply to the peace agreement and to the different points of the mediation. At the continental level, we have the African Union, from which we know that Sudan is already suspended, and most of the time, suspension is the last arrow in the African Union's quiver. So it doesn't leave much for the African Union. It doesn't leave room for the African Union to also be the compelling voice in the cacophony of mediation efforts. And that brings us to the IGAD level, which has been ably addressed. I believe that the neighbors are the most effective, potentially the most effective compellers for the implementation of the different outcomes of the different mediation processes. Return to civilian rule will of course be another challenge that the mediation will have to take on, and particularly implementing the parts of the agreement that relate to the security sector reform. If the SSR is undertaken per the agreement, it's going to be a compromised win in the truest sense of the term. So neither party is going to leave satisfied. And that brings me to my last point. It's that mediation is compelling, but unfortunately not compulsory. So mediation is vital, but it takes time. And it could be futile if both parties maintain a zero-sum position and believe in an all-out victory without having to compromise, and particularly without having to integrate into one army and in a power-sharing structure together with the civilians. So these are the main challenges that the mediation efforts of the Quad and the Troika will be facing. And then coming to the shortcomings in the mediation process itself. The first is the diversity of stakeholders. So as I mentioned, yes, it's not easy to have an exhaustive list of diverse stakeholders equally represented in the case of Sudan. However, we've learned from the peace process in South Sudan that the more diverse the stakeholders, the more shared the responsibility for peace. And the second is the transparency in the negotiations. Yes, mediation by itself puts us in a position where not all information can be shared openly. However, that should always be balanced with having a transparent level of communication with external parties as well. And that's for two reasons. The first is that the stakeholders, no matter how diversely represented, cannot be all contained in that room. Sudan belongs to the Sudanese people who deserve a transparent view of how the negotiations on their behalf are going. And the second aspect is that transparent negotiations also enable the implementation of the outcomes of the peace process. As we've seen recently in Ethiopia, the less transparent the negotiation, the more infringed and excluded groups are likely to become spoilers of peace in the later stages of the implementation. I hope I'm in time. Coming to recommendations for effective mediation. So the first recommendation would be towards the Quad and the Troika. It's to have a more transparent, accountable mediation effort that's paying attention to the needs and representation of diverse stakeholders across Sudan, including rebel groups, civil society organizations, women's groups representatives, youth representatives, and special vulnerable groups as well. And then the second is to keep in mind that addressing the root causes of the conflict, poverty, inequality, corruption, lack of good governance, always has to be taken into account, because aside from the manifestation of what we're seeing currently, there are root causes that will make it difficult to implement a peace agreement in the Sudanese context. The third is to coordinate the mediation efforts more closely with the African Union, with IGAD, and try to streamline the different processes for mediation that are taking place. And this particularly relates to finding points of complementarity. So let me touch upon the 5 questions that were raised by our moderator. If I look at the Quad and Troika process and see who's in the lead, I think it's a very balanced process in which the parties are, for the most part, reading the room and reading each other. But when it comes to who should be in the lead, it's neither the Quad nor the Troika, unless it's at the UN level, where these mediators are lobbying for the results they want to see at the UNSC. The lead at the regional level should be IGAD, followed by the AU, based on the principle of complementarity and subsidiarity. Are the processes complementary? Currently, no, and that's a shame, because there's so much room to make them much more complementary than they are. When we see each of the mediation processes, they focus on a certain aspect of the conflict. For example, if we see the Jeddah process, it's more focusing on the military relationships. If we see the Quad and Troika, it looks at both the civilian, military, and addressing the long-term governance issues. If we see the IGAD's and AU's efforts, and particularly the tripartite AU-IGAD-UN effort, it looks at civilian rule in the long term. So there is space to have a complementary approach to mediation based on the strong suit of the different parties. I think the question, who wants what, should be discussed by the room. I'm going to skip right through it, partly because of the sensitivity, but partly also because I think it's a huge mapping exercise to really see who wants what, even within those subgroups within the mediation. And finally, who has leverage? Despite the power the UNSC brings to the table, if it were to make the decision, despite the coordinating role and the power of coordination the African Union has, and the influence of IGAD through its member states, at the end of the day, the only parties that have leverage will be the parties in Sudan. And I think that's why the mediation has focused on, emphasized, and followed the pace of the 2 parties in Sudan. So these are my primary reflections. Thank you very much.
Great, very impressive input, very comprehensive. I learned a lot, and I think she raised some issues that we have to talk about more during the debate. So now we heard about IGAD, we heard about the Troika and the Quad, and now our next speaker has the challenging task to talk about other initiatives, of which there are obviously plenty. So I want to invite Mr. Professor Peter Kagwanja. You have his CV in front of you, but I did look him up in Google. I Googled Mr. Kagwanja, and found following information. He's an intellectual, he's an academic, he's a strategist, and he's a governmental advisor. So it's a very powerful combination. Please, you have the word.
Thank you. Thank you very much, moderator. Yes, my friend Hassan Khanenje believes that I can talk about everything. And of course, that means talking about nothing at the same time. If you speak about everything, you speak about nothing, because the focus is not there. Either way, I want to trouble your waters. I know possibly you had a very structured, very systematic, programmatic approach to the problem, but let me do what a scholar is supposed to do. It's to disturb the waters. I want to discuss the Sudan peace process, mediation processes or initiatives that are coming up as what you can call the mediation trap. And I want to say, this thing is good, yeah, sometimes technology is a big issue. And I want to say that the concept of, trapped mediations or the mediation trap is borrowed heavily from the legal profession and also from the business world, where it is assumed that the order of things is to go with the law. But if it is so punitive or too expensive, then you seek the alternative, the alternatives to the law, or if I should put it that way. In this particular case, mediation in conflict is basically a way of looking for alternative conflict resolution mechanism where the norm is battleground victory. That's what is supposed to be the norm. Because if you have battleground victory, you can establish the victor's order. And when you assert the victor's order, you have prolonged peace and stability like we have had since 1945, when America shot its way to power. America and the allies. So mediation is a very delicate process, and where people being invited to a mediation weighs their options, and sometimes they prefer to see whether there is an opportunity to sneak through and get a victor's order. But at the same time, mediators are also opportunistic, because you up your profile, you increase your value by basically being the leader of mediation. And nations are beginning to make a profile for themselves as mediators, even when they do not completely understand the mediation process, the complex situation that they are supposed to mediate. I want to argue that very few of the mediators or the mediation initiatives that that have been talked about understand or take into account the complex and protracted nature of the Sudanese situation to offer something more concrete than just the normal mediations. Sudan has been described as the worst crisis in the country's history, the current one. But that is all that has been said. I think the preoccupation is on what the conflict between General Abdel Fattah Burhani and his competitor, General Mohammed Hamdan, both representing two forms of violence in Sudan. They represent two forms of violence. One representing the traditional coercive state form of violence, and the other one, the informal form of violence that has recently been formalized, but has not gelled into the formal system of violence. And therefore, in this case, what one is arguing is that we are dealing with a complex legacy of Omar Bashir's coercive state that used violence in order to stay in power. And how can you mediate generations of violence and seek a quick solution to it? General Bashir introduced, in the 1990s, used the military very well, and the police and other former security forces. But when Darfur came into the question, and other scattered violence within Sudan, he decided to go informal and brought about what we call informal repression. And that is how the Rapid Response Force was born. But when it came to the picture, it got into the complexity of globalized power politics. And the force, what was informal violence, became stronger than the form of violence because it is more tested, it is more used. 40,000 troops in Yemen, a number of troops in Chad, other troops in Libya. So the force which is supposed to be informal is the more established and more used. So what is the point that one is making? The point I am trying to make is that the Sudanese conflict is a multi-layered conflict. Multi-layered. In other words, it has multiple layers of conflict. There are multiple layers of conflict. And these multiple layers of conflict are building on each other. And we identify three in modern times, I think from 2018. One is civilian protests, which would sometimes take a violent form against a dictatorial system. It succeeded and removed Omar al-Bashir. But the military nipped that. Both the form of violence and the informal violence combined to basically thwart the succession of civilian revolution. And when they came to power, so we see civilians versus the military power. The third form is where we have the military now competing within itself, the form of violence versus the informal violence. And that is the stage at which we are dealing with. So the big question is, what are interveners trying to solve, or what are they trying to mediate? Are they trying to mediate the form of violence against the informal violence? Or are they trying to mediate the civilian intentions versus the military intentions? Or what exactly that we are going to get? I've looked at all the mediations, Dr. Hassan Khanenje, and specifically people are entering in their mediation initiative guided by their own personal, the interests of their states, rather than a clear and comprehensive understanding of the situation in Sudan. Take, for example, the gender platform, what we are calling the Quad, or you're using very technical terms, Quad, Troika, and all that. But the gender process simply means the interest of Sudan's neighbors across the Red Sea, and whatever else they form as coalitions globally. And the gender process simply is a search for a quick solution to the process, because you want to be exclusive so that you reach a decision very quickly. And what is your force? Because you have worked with the two forms of violence. You have worked with, Hamidit, and you have worked with Burhani. Therefore, you think you can bring the two guys and you solve the problem. Does that solve the Sudanese problem? No. So the gender process failed on the card of inclusion. Then, and I want to be quick, then we come to the IGAD process. IGAD is not new to Sudan. It brokered the comprehensive peace process that created South Sudan. And therefore, it is tested. But why is its process faltering now? Because of geopolitical consideration, but more increasingly because IGAD itself is at a very interesting state. Let me just use the word interesting, whatever that may mean to you. Interesting because the chair of IGAD is actually Sudan. He says, yes, the chair of IGAD at the moment is Sudan. So how can you mediate? Because the seat was given by Kenya and Ethiopia to Abdar Hamdok as a way of brokering what was then tensions within the Horn of Africa. And when Hamdok was overthrown, he was overthrown with the chairmanship of IGAD. So, so here we are with a body that you want to mediate and itself needs mediation, or is in exile if you wish. The third initiative is the neighboring countries, which is a fight back, Egypt and Chad. But they are more potent because they have a better, deeper historical tradition with Sudan than the rest of the mediators. The Sudanese military is tailored along the lines of the Egyptian military, where a military controls every facet of society, economy, society, production, industry, and finance. It controls and commands what we call the commanding heads of the economy. And that is your Egyptian model, which is exercised in Sudan. And when you move to Darfur and Chad, these are battle-hardened people in very serious areas. Therefore, Chad and Egypt are the serious actors. And I don't think that you can get any mediation without involving them. So when they talk about the neighboring countries initiative, that needs to be taken serious, because you can't go far without checking. The fourth one, the fourth mediation process that we find here is African Union initiative. Obviously, the chairman of the African Union, here I'm very undiplomatic, is from Chad. And therefore, he has the sensitivities of direct intervention, because you don't know at what point you'll be accused of this or that. He's from Chad. And he's not just an ordinary scholar or practitioner from Chad. He's one of the power elite competing for power in Chad. Those who are familiar with the African Union politics. So, in a sense, he has been hesitant to take a stronger position, and instead, you take the civilian. So you go to the first dispute, which is the civilian contest against the military. And the military versus the military takes us a backstage. And this is where the UN steps in. The UN steps in to create what they're calling the extended mechanism. And the extended mechanism is basically a UN attempt to ensure that they are not the leadership is not taken from them on the basis of the principle of subsidiarity. So the UN perhaps is the most comprehensive initiative now. Why? Because it brings in the African Union, it brings in IGAD and no other players, but eventually it is what I'm doing. You are everything and nothing at the same time, because the focus is questionable. So in conclusion, if I may say, we have two major scenarios which experts are proposing. One scenario is basically to introduce the principle of division of labor. Division of labor, all these initiatives, from wherever they come with their specialities. So, the gender process takes the military question. You resolve the military problem. The African Union and IGAD solve the civilian question and come up with a transitional document leading to democracy and so on. The other processes deal with the neighboring countries initiative address the humanitarian questions. So there is a division of labor, the local neighbors dealing with humanitarian issues because of spillover effects of refugees and so on. Then we have the Red Sea neighbors dealing with the military question because they are the ones who have had a history of military interactions and arming of the various sections in Sudan, and the Africans in their entirety to deal with the transitional question. Is that viable? Yes, it is, but who is going to preside over this process? Who is going to be the one calling the shot on behalf of this division of labor? The answer is perhaps the African Union and IGAD working with the UN, establishing a framework within which they can oversee this process. But that division of labor also is going to be questioned, because Egypt will not allow the military question to be dealt by one country alone. Fine, therefore, we are left with one option: to go for battleground victory, and you support the strongest. That's one option. Yeah, it's one option. We did that in Angola. the Namibia, the Savibi, Dos Santos situation was, yes, so you had to deal with it that way. But is that the way to deal with it? I think the onus is on African Union and IGAD to take the mantle of leadership and successfully mediate the Sudanese conflict. Sudan's mediation is a litmus test to the mantra of African solutions to African problems. Africa must take charge. Thank you. Okay, can I go with it?
But I think you're going to get it back very soon. So thank you, Professor. So you did not only deliver a profound analysis, but came up with a plan. So with this, I want to open up and try to bring you into the debate. I believe there will be many questions. If not, I have lots of questions. So. Okay, I'm a bit stunned because this morning everyone wanted to talk about the mediation efforts, and now there are no questions. Okay, let me then start with my questions. First of all, to Mr. Ochanda. So, we have listened to IGAD's many activities, but is there an outreach, an active outreach from the IGAD side to the other mediators? That question goes to you. And then I want to ask Professor Kagbanja again, because I think he posed the core question. The core question is, what do the mediators want to mediate? What is the ultimate goal? So, and I think obviously Egypt has a different interest than Saudi Arabia, but I would like to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on this question that you posed, and to Rahel. So, you know, when you started saying, well, Norway is a very experienced mediator, I was surprised because I think Norway is not the most experienced mediator, right? But there is an interesting combination with the Quad and the Troika. So what chances do you see the two? I even don't understand why one is Quad and the other one is Troika, and Norway is in both. So if you could explain what is the added value of these two, and at the same time, to all or three, I want to ask the question. You'll remember I started with the Libyan example, right? I mean, Libya. All peace initiatives basically failed. But there was a time and there was a phase where it looked like everything gonna work out perfectly. When was that? When Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, convened all these so-called mediators in Berlin for the Berlin conference, showed personal commitment and made them commit to a negotiation framework. That was considered the most successful negotiation framework that Libya had experienced. So, but why it did not succeed? Very simple. Because Angela Merkel departed. So we did not have this personal commitment from the German government anymore. We had a change of government. So, linked to this is the question, which country could play a similar role? So with this, let's start with Mr. Walter. So maybe, yeah, you want to come up or just, you have a question?
So the first question you've had, so I can go on to the second one. So the second question on the issue of commitment problem, where we have the parties not wanting to come to the table at this juncture, mainly because there is no guarantee in a way that their issues will be taken up or resolved to an extent. And how do you think that's an issue to start with in the Sudan conflict? And is there a way to resolve it? Yeah.
And then we only have 3 mics.
Yeah. Sorry. I mean, just looking forward rather than the diagnosis, but looking at it from the perspective of just prognosis of what is going to happen. I think, in my opinion, the situation is very complex, and here myself is a Sudanese, beside working for the EU, myself is a Sudanese. I think, I think that we need an African Union lead for a lot of reasons, and there should be a panel composed of not 1 or 2, probably 2 to 3 head of states, one representing the League of Arabic States, such as Algeria, who have got the extensive experience in mediation. Then another country that represents IGAD, in this case Kenya, and a third country that it could be Egypt, but others might say, if you call Egypt, then Ethiopia is going to say, why not? And also there is Chad, and I think it's been mentioned now that the previous speaker, that while we don't mention a lot Chad in this since the morning, but we need to recognize that Chad is seriously important for Sudan, as in Egypt. Egypt is not about the 400 and something thousand that went as refugees. There is already 5 million Sudanese in Egypt, 5 million. So half of, almost 1/4 of Sudan lives in Egypt. So that's very serious, Egypt's role. So a panel like that has to be decided by a Peace and Security Council decision, an African Union communique, endorsed by the UN Security Council, given the difficulty at the UN Security Council. We need to move forward in that sense. And that's to negotiate with the 2 belligerents. And I think the belligerents here, the key question is, what is the end game for Burhan? What is the end game for Hemeti? What do you want? Is it accountability, to drop the issue of accountability? Is the business, we talked about how it is related to economy. We need to address the end games. We need those countries to give assurances to work with the rest of the international community. There is the core group where there is the League of Arabic States, African Union, European Union, US, KSA, all the core group of the African Union roadmap. That core group through the Secretariat to work with the panel and so on, so that to move forward. We need to be practically, this is possible to move forward and to drop the regional egos. And we know that, and we need to know that one person, it is too big to chew, and you are going to get choked. So you need to have that, a bigger mouth, and a bigger mouth is to have a panel under the African Union auspices. This is the best way forward, I think, for Sudan.
Yeah.
At the same time, it's killing. So we will cope with it. Mm-hmm. So here comes another question.
Yes. It's a question and a view also. Given what was described is the basis and influence of the Sudanese conflict. That it goes beyond Sudan alone, affects the Sahel region, affects the Arab League, the Gulf and the Red Sea. And therefore, it would have been most fitting if it was recognized by the UN Security Council as a threat not only to Sudan, but wider to the region and even across with other regions, not Africa alone. It would have been most fitting, actually, for the UN to take this and then have sort of this panel to be coordinated, from the AU, the Arab League, and others, from ECOWAS also. Many countries in the Sahel region are engaged in this. Libya is engaged in this. It would have been most fitting for the UN. The unfortunate thing with the UN was that it has already deployed a peace-building mission, not a peacemaking mission, not a mediation or political mission, but a peace-building mission already, not fit for purpose. Well, it also failed to appoint our suggestion. I mean, they had asked for suggestions. The suggestion that were being given, including from the AU, was appoint an African mediator who would also be endorsed by the African Union, and I'm sure IGAD would also endorse that, and then that would be the rallying point for all those that are concerned with the consequences of the conflict in Sudan. Unfortunately, the UN Security Council would not take that position. So he said it delegated it to the African Union. So it is not the best way we are looking for now, but the possible way, actually, that we are being considered, that is being considered. Within that context, I think what has been proposed, that there has to be, with the African Union also being, not so strong on this, that if we were to build around this IGAD was best. And it is good, actually, what was proposed, that could be enriched then wider. It is not the best solution. It is the possible solution, in my opinion.
Thank you. So I don't see any other questions, so I would like to invite
Thank you. Let me respond to the question raised about is IGAD making outreaches to other initiatives. I think in my presentation I made mention that IGAD is part of the expanded framework, which of course has the AU and also the Arab League. So IGAD is part of that process. Of course, the core group. IGAD is working jointly with all these AU-led initiative, but also IGAD is part of the secretariat of this expanded framework initiative. So, in a nutshell, IGAD is already participating or engaging.
was IGAD invited to Jeddah?
Well, at some point, yes, there was an invitation. At some point, IGAD was invited, yes. Yes, IGAD was invited as an observer, but did not participate, yes. Yes, you're right. But under the AU framework, yes, IGAD has also been part of the trilateral arrangement, as I mentioned earlier. And then your the second question you raised was, who could lead? I think from the IGAD side, we are operating within the framework of the quartet. And the quartet has, of course, the 4 countries, and the quartet has a chair. So the chair is the lead in this sense. And that's the decision of the summit. And that decision can only be reversed by another summit decision. So as it stands now, IGAD's framework is the quartet. And of course, the lead is Kenya as it stands now. I think these were the 2 questions directed to me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the questions and the reflections in the room as well. I think let me start with maybe the easier question to answer, which is Norway's role as an experienced mediator. So yes, I would say Norway has proven to be an experienced mediator, particularly in the Horn and East of Africa, and to some extent in Central Africa as well. So, for example, the Partnership for Peace on the Inter-Burundian Dialogue, Norway is one of the members. They were part of IGAD Plus and facilitated the South Sudan peace process. And most recently, Norway also took part together with the government of Kenya in facilitating dialogue between the government of Ethiopia and the Oromo Liberation Front in Zanzibar. So these are a few instances that can be raised on their experiences. But these particular experiences aside, I think Norway is also one of the trusted partners in African peace and security in general, and they have had a dedication to slow, quiet building of capacity on mediation efforts, on peacekeeping at both the continental, regional, and national levels. So coming to what is the added value of having both the Quad and the Troika? I try to navigate the politics of the mediation on that level, but both UK and Norway are part of both groups, and really the main difference between those two groups is that US is in one group and UAE and Saudi Arabia are in another. So I think